The book of Job is one of the most perplexing and controversial books in the Bible. It deals with profound themes such as suffering, divine justice, and human faith, raising challenging questions about God's role in human suffering. The story begins with a description of Job, a righteous man living in Uz, who is described as blameless and upright, a man who feared God and shunned evil. Job chapter 1, verse 1. Job is blessed with wealth, a large family, and good health, but not for long. The disturbing aspects of Job's story start early on. In the opening chapters, Satan, or the Adversary, appears before God in heaven. God points out Job's righteousness and faithfulness, but Satan challenges God, suggesting that Job is only loyal because of the blessings he has received. Satan proposes that if Job's wealth, family, and health were taken away, Job would curse God. Surprisingly, God agrees to this test, allowing Satan to take away all of Job's blessings without any real reason other than to prove Job's faithfulness. Job chapter 1, verse 6 to 12. Job's suffering unfolds in brutal waves. First, Job's livestock, which represents his wealth, is stolen by raiders, and his servants are killed. Job chapter 1, verse 14 to 15. Then, a great wind causes the house where Job's children were gathered to collapse, killing all 10 of his children. Job chapter 1, verse 18 to 19. Despite these immense losses, Job remains faithful. Satan, however, persuades God to test Job further, afflicting him with painful boils all over his body. Job chapter 2, verse 7. Job is left sitting in ashes, scraping his sores with broken pottery in physical and emotional agony. Job initially remains faithful, famously saying, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Job chapter 1, verse 21. However, as the suffering continues and the weight of his losses bears down on him, Job begins to question God. He curses the day he was born, asking why God would allow such suffering for someone who has lived righteously. Job chapter 3, verse 1 to 26. Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, visit him to comfort him. However, their comfort turns into judgment. They argue that Job must have sinned to deserve such suffering, suggesting that God is just and would not allow such things to happen to a righteous person. As described in chapters 4 through 25, Job, in turn, defends his innocence and questions the justice of his suffering. The most disturbing part of the narrative comes when God finally responds to Job's complaints, rather than providing comfort or explaining the reason for Job's suffering. God speaks from a whirlwind, rebuking Job for questioning him. God asks a series of rhetorical questions, emphasizing his power and the mystery of his ways, saying, "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation?" Job chapter 38, verse 4. God's response is essentially, "I am God, and you are not," offering no explanation or justification for Job's suffering. In the end, Job's fortunes are restored. He receives double the wealth he had before, and he has more children. Job chapter 42, verse 10 to 17. The disturbing aspects of the story remain unresolved. Job's first set of children are never brought back, and the divine wager between God and Satan, which caused all this suffering, remains unaddressed. The question of why Job, a righteous man, had to suffer so greatly is left unanswered, except for God's assertion of his absolute power. The story of Job presents a number of theological and ethical contradictions, particularly with the broader biblical themes of God's love, justice, and mercy, as well as Jesus' teachings on forgiveness and the nature of God. 1. God's role in suffering. The most glaring issue is that God initiates the suffering by allowing Satan to test Job. The idea that God would gamble with a human being's life to prove a point seems to contradict the image of a loving and merciful God found elsewhere in the Bible. In the New Testament, God is portrayed as loving and protective, yet here, he allows a faithful servant to suffer immensely for no clear reason other than to prove Job's faith. 2. Lack of justice. God's response to Job is troubling because it offers no clear explanation for Job's suffering. Job is innocent, and yet he suffers as if he is guilty. This seems to contradict the many passages in the Bible where God is described as just and fair. Psalm 11:7 says, "For the Lord is righteous, he loves justice. The upright will see his face." But Job's story suggests otherwise, where the upright suffer without reason. 3. The problem of innocent suffering. Job's story also raises questions about the broader problem of innocent suffering. In the Bible, God is often seen as a protector of the innocent, yet in this case, he allows a blameless man to endure unimaginable pain. This seems inconsistent with Jesus' teachings in the New Testament, where God is described as a loving father who cares deeply for his children. For example, Matthew 6:26 speaks of God caring even for the birds of the air, implying he cares much more for humans. 4. Contradiction with Jesus' teachings. In the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, verse 7, Jesus teaches about God's mercy, forgiveness, and love. He emphasizes that God is a compassionate father who provides for his children. The story of Job, however, presents a God who allows a faithful servant to suffer without explanation. This portrayal contradicts the God of forgiveness and love that Jesus speaks about, especially in teachings such as, love your enemies, Matthew chapter 5, verse 44, and forgive as the Father forgives you, Matthew chapter 6, verse 14. Scholars have long debated the book of Job, and many acknowledge the ethical and theological problems it poses. Scholars see Job as a prime example of the problem of theodicy, the question of why a good God allows evil and suffering. Some suggest that the book of Job presents a challenge to simple answers about divine justice, forcing readers to wrestle with the complexity of suffering. However, this leaves unresolved the question of whether God's actions in the story are compatible with his goodness. Many scholars point out that God's refusal to explain Job's suffering is troubling. Elie Wiesel, a Holocaust survivor and Jewish scholar, found deep discomfort in Job's story, viewing it as a story of divine abandonment. What do you think about this? Share your thoughts with me in the comments before we move on to the next story.